I don't have any misgivings, because, I mean, it can't be wrong for people to listen to each other, but I suspect there will be a lot of talking past each other. I mean, it's bound to be so in this act.
Recently been at a conference in Jerusalem with the rather unpromising title Absence and Negation in Literature and Literary Theory. It was nevertheless quite an interesting conference, despite that title.
And it takes a lot of doggedness, I think, for the average woman to get up in front of a phalanx of men. Most of the speakers have been men. And really to force through a point of view.
The papers were commodities, and if the hall itself was commodious, then we felt rather like a commode, and we were playing a commode to the speakers in the platform. I think that's something that we objected to. I think we, like the Wolfman, felt that we were being shat on from a great height.
On what turned out to be one of the hottest weekends in the summer of 1986, some 300 people from every corner of the globe converged on the city of Glasgow to sit from morning till night in a crowded and stuffy room listening to lectures with titles like Functionalism and Stylistics, Directions from Structuralism, and On Syllable Counting Verse and Pattern Poetry in the Old Testament. This behaviour, which might seem mystifying or perverse to an outsider, is in fact a very common feature of modern academic life. As an academic myself, I've attended a fair number of conferences. I've also published a novel called Small World, which takes a rather irreverent look at the conference phenomenon. My working title for the novel that's been referred to already several times today was not actually Small World, but as we assemble for the 6th time, it seems just as appropriate to this phenomenon. It was, we can't go on meeting like this. So I attended this one in a dual capacity, as one of the principal speakers, but also as what Desmond Morris might have called a conference watcher. All conferences have a family resemblance to each other, but each one has its own plot, one might say, and of course its own cast of characters. Most of the people attending this conference fell into two broad categories. Either they were linguists, primarily interested in language as a system, or they were literary critics, primarily interested in the meanings of texts. These two groups, though they work side by side in universities, seldom engage in public debate with each other. The aim of the Strathclyde Conference was to arrange just such a confrontation.
Perhaps misunderstood, almost certainly disagreed, about two phrases, the nature of language and natural language. And I wanted to observe only that before we rush past those hesitations and possible misunderstandings.
Raymond, do you go to many conferences?
As few as possible, but I had some genuine curiosity about this one.
What was the curiosity?
That English studies have had this separation between language and literature in the conventional descriptions, and this has been very damaging. There has been for 10 years or so some active contact, but of a very particular kind, and I wanted to see what the state of the argument was now. The objective is one that I'm deeply committed to. There are so many ways of doing it, however. I wanted to come and see what the present balance of forces and tendencies was.
This parted history of the first death of structuralism is deplorable.
Structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, these were words we were to hear frequently in the course of the conference.
In any event, it is relevant to me only inasmuch as it allows me to show certain similarities between the first and the second deaths of structuralism. For today, we have been quite unmistakably ushered into the post-structuralist, deconstructionist era. It may be useful then to ask what structuralism this post-structuralism...
Attention was focused on these matters partly because of the presence of the French philosopher and inventor of deconstruction, Jacques Derrida.
Deconstruction as a way of analyzing, essentially a way of transforming our analysis of consciousness, of the author's consciousness, which is not essentially deconstruction. The problem of consciousness is a very local and marginal problem for deconstruction. So why do you insist on consciousness?
The word writing in our title had, for those in the know, and anyone who didn't know probably wouldn't care, invisible quotation marks around it, put there by Derrida. Structuralism explains all forms of cultural production, including literature, in terms of the systems of signification they employ. Everything in human culture signifies by virtue of an underlying system or grammar. Traffic lights, for instance, function because drivers understand the coded significance of red, amber, green, and the rules governing their sequences. 3 other colours would do just as well, provided everybody understood the system. A menu presupposes the rule that one item must be selected from each set and combined in a certain order. A meal, starter, main course, dessert, has a structure, like the structure of a sentence, subject, verb, object. Structuralism took the systematic study of language, pioneered by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, as its model of intellectual inquiry. This model, however, assumes that language works, an assumption Derrida challenged. Language, he argues, is a much more slippery and devious medium than we imagine, constantly undermining the claim of our discourse to mean something finite and specific. It's long been recognised that literary texts can have meanings not intended by their authors, partly because the writer is not physically present to control the reception of his message. This, according to Derrida, makes writing not a special case of language, but its most authentic realisation. Writing exposes what we prefer to ignore or conceal, that meaning is endlessly deferred, never grasped, that all our discourse is founded on the void. This idea has given equal offence to traditional humanists who believe that literature communicates valuable truths, and to linguists who believe that their discipline is an exact science. So there was much potential controversy secreted in the title of the conference, The Linguistics of Writing.
I still have the feeling that in certain of these areas the great confrontations occur in print, or at long distance. If they did happen face to face, as sometimes they should, it would be better. But I hope maybe they will.
It's not just the title, though, that draws people to a conference. It can be a sort of working holiday, too, usually subsidised by a grant. Strathclyde offered the principal speakers the extra inducement of a few days' rest and recreation immediately before the conference at Ross Priory, the university's elegant country club on the scenic shores of Loch Lomond. And sometimes there are more personal motives.
It was an offer that I could not refuse. They have a cousin living here in Glasgow, I think Nigel made the invitation in his presence, and if I had said no, that would have caused great problems. But anyway, that was not really. I did really want to come back to Glasgow.
Well, I always want the conference to be as far away from Berkeley as possible.
The fact that Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, and Frederick Jameson were invited was a crucial thing for me, because it meant that the conception of the conference was, or the conference had on its agenda, an attempt to make some connections between linguistic and language study and a set of issues involving cultural study, social theory, the nexus between language and social theory that those critics represent. So that kind of agenda was the reason that I was interested.
So you're a bit disappointed?
Unfortunately, two of the speakers mentioned by Mary Louise Pratt, Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton, had withdrawn from the conference. So had Edward Said. All three are men of the left. Their absence somewhat unbalanced the conference programme and disappointed many conferees. The days and hours immediately before a conference can be anxious ones for the main speakers. It's rather like waiting to go over the top or into bat.
There's certainly a tension, I hope a productive tension, because I'll be speaking not to a couple of hundred interested participants from various parts of the world, but some of the most important figures in these areas of academic study in the world, and to give a paper before that audience, knowing that they're sitting there and waiting to ask questions afterwards, is bound to be nerve-wracking, especially before the whole conference has begun to establish its own atmosphere and its own mood. So in a way, I have the job of trying to raise what I see as some of the most crucial questions at the beginning.
He argued both that stylistic analyses were...
Cynthia Chase had the less intimidating prospect of chairing a lecture given by somebody else, Stanley Fish.
I imagine it's simply a matter of acknowledging people with hands raised in the audience and getting Stanley Fish to stop speaking, which may be a challenge.
If you go into a classroom and start doing a few things which give you and your audience, presumably your dead poet, pleasure,
Professor Stanley Fish is a dynamic American critic, sometimes thought to be the model for my own fictitious character, Morris Zapp.
You've just jetted in from across the Atlantic this morning, come straight into the conference. Is this deliberate? I mean, do you like to plunge into a conference when it's already started?
No, it's not deliberate, or operating under the wrong assumption that if you give yourself enough time, or if you give yourself maximum time as you're coming to a conference to deliver a paper, you will do a better job in writing the paper. But of course it doesn't matter at all. No matter how much time you gave yourself, the results would always be the same, and you'd never have enough time.
Right.
It's just a psychological self-deception that always works.
Day one of a conference that would squeeze 17 lectures into 3 days. These expectant faces at the registration desk would hardly see daylight again until Sunday evening.
Before I introduce the speaker, I would like very briefly to apologize to you for any inconvenience caused by the cameras in the hall. They are filming a documentary on the conference to be broadcast on Channel 4, and I hope they will not be too intrusive.
To those whose knowledge of structuralism is gleaned chiefly from newspapers, Colin McCabe is well known as the central figure in a much publicised row at the University of Cambridge in 1981. He was, therefore, a very suitable person to open the conference.
Who has performed Herculean labours in preparing and organising this event.
Nigel Fabb and his Strathclyde colleague Alan Durant seemed perhaps surprisingly young men to be organising a conference with aspirations to be a landmark in the history of linguistics and literary criticism.
The last 25 years have seen a lot of changes in the academic environment in linguistics and in literature and in philosophy. And one of the ideas of the conference was to show how things have changed since then. There was a conference about 30 years ago called Style in Language, which is published in this book. A conference which in some ways wasn't very successful in bringing things together. Now, we now think that the possibilities of bringing disciplines together are better than they used to be.
One motive for staging the conference was to publicise a postgraduate course in literary linguistics, which Nigel Fabb and Alan Durant teach at Strathclyde.
I think people still think about universities as a bit like kind of churches, but in some ways the university's become, it's kind of changing from sort of church to shopping mall. I mean, there are contradictions there because it still retains some of that kind of spiritual feel, but at the same time, the sense that you're buying things. And that actually passes on into the conference itself, where I think people are coming to be able to sit at the feet of the masters and kind of receive almost spiritual knowledge, but at the same time they're buying commodities, and those commodities are the masters.
In one sense, the Thatcher years have been very bad for universities because of contraction. On the other hand, they have meant that lots of new small-scale initiatives with responsibility for their own financial management can get initiated. The good side of that is that when you plan small, it's possible to innovate. The bad side of that is that you're very much dependent on financial viability in terms of income from student fees. Many of those students are sponsored by the governments of developing countries, and it can very quickly become the case that new courses, new miniature departments only exist on the basis of sponsorship and subsidy from developing countries which don't really have the money to spend on such things.
In these days of what Malcolm Bradbury has called the new sadomonetarism, it seems that university lecturers must also be entrepreneurs if they are to survive.
If you ask me whether Thatcherite policies are good for us, it depends what you mean by those policies. But I happen to believe that there have to be radical changes. The idea of soft money flowing into universities forever is over.
The 1958 conference, called Style in Language, mentioned by Fabb and Durant as a kind of benchmark for their own conference, is particularly associated with a famous closing statement on the relationship between linguistics and poetics by one of the legendary masters of structuralism, Roman Jakobson. In homage to Jakobson, and also perhaps in a spirit of Derridean verbal playfulness, Derek Attridge called his opening lecture Closing Statement, and Colin McCabe was to close the conference with an opening statement. This probably seemed like a good idea when they dreamt it up.
The work of Jacques Derrida would suggest that Jakobson's confident incorporation of literary studies into linguistics might to some extent be reversible, and that the particular problems which arise when we try to define, to categorize, to fix literary or indeed philosophical writing might be problems produced as much by the nature of language itself as by those particular uses of it. These questions are certainly not closed, nor will they be by the end of this conference. But I can imagine no group of scholars and theorists more likely to provide a rigorous and illuminating opening of them than those who will be speaking after me. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is to talk about a real text and to, analyze real words that follow in a real sequence and that form real patterns that you will see. And in fact, if you have the handout, it's on the other side of the handout. And that's a real thing. And they are not theoretical.
The kernel of Morita was that the famous Psalm 137, beginning, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept, remembering thee, O Zion," has a pictorial dimension hidden in the original Hebrew.
I'd made a discovery about a literary work of art that's extremely well known, that's completely different from what it's supposed to be. And it has to do with its visual, that is, its graphic shape.
When the poem is laid on its side, as it were, the pattern of its syllables represents the temple at Jerusalem, or so Halley claimed.
Does it look like a building the way the scribes write it? Do they seem to have written it?
No, nobody has ever written it at all. In the Bible, it's just written one word after the other as a prose text.
Doesn't that somewhat militate against your suggestion?
That my suggestion was that was a discovery. If you don't like it, well, hell, I go back to the Bible.
The first lecture to set the conference alight was Mary Louise Pratt's, entitled Linguistic Utopias. She argued that linguistic scholarship is based on a misleading, idealized model of a speech community, which is assumed to share a single common language. In reality, communication usually takes place within a single state or culture between groups who have distinct languages or dialects of their own. Which language becomes the official or dominant one is determined by the power relations that exist between the different groups. Whites and blacks, for instance, colonizers and colonized, men and women.
Here, for example, is a silly list of verbal practices which have been associated in the literature with women and connected either to their subordination or to their activity in the domestic sphere. 1. Planting a suggestion in the mind of another person in such a way that they think they initiated it themselves. 2. Speaking to one person in such a way that another person hears and is affected in the desired fashion. 3. In academic writing, gradually building up evidence toward a main point rather than stating the point at the beginning and then backing it up. 4. Storytelling as a way of communicating values to children, for example. 5. Gossip as a means of supporting and surveilling each other and as a form of power over men who fear this secret network. 6. Talking often repetitively with another person for the purpose of maintaining a shared world with them, also known as small talk. 7. Talking to subjects who don't know language at all, babies, animals, plants, TV sets, and walls. Moreau's argument offers me an entry point for looking at a kind of linguistics that begins where the linguistics of community leaves off. A linguistics that places at its center the operation of language across lines of differentiation. A linguistics that focuses on modes and zones of contact between, say, dominant and dominated groups, members of different nations and cultures, speakers of different languages. I'll call it a linguistics of contact.
This phrase, the linguistics of contact, quickly became the conference buzzword. It was new, it was snappy, and it gave out vibrations that many of the conferees wanted to feel. It's hearing a paper like this that makes you glad you came to the conference.
Like many people, when I first set out to attend one that I've agreed to attend a few months before, I asked myself the question, why am I doing this, and I'm sure that I shouldn't be. Then after hearing, for example, an excellent paper like Mary Pratt's, I know why I'm here.
Can you crack the dingbat? Dingbat, the game that'll drive everyone dingbats.
When your child's off colour, you don't have to give him artificial colouring to make him feel better. So here's a range of children's medicines with all the artificial colour taken out. And it's made by Boots. That's better. When your child's feeling out of order, turn to Boots Medicines.
Thinking of leather? Unique designs from our Cambridge workshops give you quality at low prices. Come to Mars, the leather shop, Rose Crescent, Cambridge.
The Braun Multipractic Hand Blender, designed to do whatever you want, wherever you want. The perfect gift from Braun, especially for yourself.
Every time you buy a tin of Campbell's soup, what you're actually buying is this, because Campbell's soup is condensed, and so it leaves you this much room to add recipe ideas of your own, even something simple like milk in our cream of tomato. Campbell's, the only soup that leaves you this much room for your own ideas.
Hello? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
voice like an angel.
You get more from a birthday greeting made by phone.
Your grandmother's very happy.
British Telecom. It's you we answer to.
Simply had to tell you about our new Coleman's home-style cooking sauces. The special pack seals in the freshness and flavour, so there's no need for any added artificial colours or preservatives. They make an everyday meal simply delicious. Coleman's. Always make the best a touch better.
It was time for me to think about my own paper. I had elected to speak on the work of the Russian critic and theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who died in 1975 after a long and productive life, during most of which he'd been prevented by the Stalinist regime from publishing his work.
I don't know if it's an advantage or a disadvantage.
My paper was entitled After
in
Bakhtin.
a long, hot day. I don't know whether the organisers thought Bakhtin was the Russian word for dinner, and that they asked me to speak now, they might get an amusing discourse rather than a scholarly one. I need hardly say that Bakhtin is a rather reassuring sort of subject for somebody who's written a carnivalesque novel about conferences and finds himself addressing a conference. But
one of Bakhtin's seminal ideas was that language in use is innately As a literary critic, Bakhtin favoured prose fiction, which exploits dialogism, over the poetic genre of epic, lyric and classical tragedy, which he described as monologic. The monologic genre used a single style, a single voice, to give authority to a single point of view. Perhaps, I suggested, the scholarly paper is such a genre.
The sense of literary and linguistic scholarship to say the last word about its subject, therefore, always entails a certain measure of self-deception or bad faith, which manifests itself in various discursive symptoms. For instance, it has been observed, I think it was in an article in PMLA some years ago, but I didn't have time to find the reference. It's been observed that the prefaces and forewords to academic books are always much milder and more tentative than the discourses they introduce. They're full of qualifications, disclaimers, professions of humility, effusive thanks to friends, colleagues, spouses, all propitiative and ingratiating gestures. It's as if the authors, rather dismayed by the monologic arrogance of the discourses they've produced, are seeking at the last minute a dialogue with their potential readers over the heads of these discourses.
My chairperson, Jane Tompkins, however, had some doubts about the notion of the dialogic.
What I would be in favor of it would be the sort of a kind of an out-and-out acknowledgement of one's monologism. That is, what is one's polemic? You know, what do I stand for? Who am I? What chip do I have on my shoulder? What is it that I'm trying to put over on you? In other words, an acknowledgement of the situatedness and particularity of the speaker, and openness about one's closure.
Yes, but I just wonder whether that wouldn't render you unable to do anything, actually. I mean, I see, just as I have a sort of awful feeling that scholarly discourse has to have this kind of will to power if knowledge is to progress, but
Well, wait a minute. You think that scholarly discourse has to have a will to power if knowledge is to progress?
Well, I think that's the model on which it's proceeded so far. I'm just wondering whether if we give up that model and we all enjoy a sense of togetherness and openness, we'd actually get anywhere.
But I thought you were on the other side, David.
Well, I am as a writer, as a creative writer, but not as a critic.
Jane Tompkins was, of course, perfectly right. I was contradicting myself. But having replayed that dialogue, it seems to me that I was also failing to understand Jane. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe we were enacting a problem at the heart of the conference's subject, indeed at the heart of all discourse, including this film itself. Writing is a more efficient medium of explanation and analysis than speech, but also a more repressive and manipulative one. Several speakers commented on this swings and roundabouts situation.
So while writing puts language in chains by forcing it to consciousness, in the process changing the basis of its organization, it freezes it, becoming something to be reflected on, but it also changes the way that language is used for thinking with, and therefore the structure of thought. It deprives us, while we're using it, of the power to intuit, to make indefinitely many connections in different directions at once, to explore contradictions and represent experience as flux. It is therefore destructive.
Writing is innately monologic and must make a rhetorical effort to dialogize itself. Speech is innately dialogic, but becomes monologic when the person addressed is silenced by the rules of the discourse, as when listening to a lecture, for instance. At the end of the lecture, there is a limited and formalized dialogic discourse, the question and discussion period. And then it's striking how confident lecturers often become hesitant, even inarticulate, when deprived of the crutch of their written text.
The various trains and
there's one more thing that you said that I want to answer, but I've kind of forgotten.
Let me come back to the nature of language. Yes, obviously, again, we've learnt to beware of totalizations and so forth. I think one simply has to learn to operate with them. I mean, not to learn to, but to record. In other words, it's simply no good. You will simply not get anywhere.
No reflection on Professor Halliday and the others. Most of us are guilty of this sort of thing in spontaneous speech.
We are talking about language as communication, and we will rule out of court failures of communication.
On the contrary, they represent very much part of the picture.
No, I'm not very happy with the statement you made about language is going to change itself.
No. I mean, no way. What I said was...
The more dialogic a discourse is, the more open it is not only to a multiplicity of viewpoints, but also to confusion, imprecision, mistakes and cross-purposes. Conversely, the more monologic a discourse is, the more lucid and coherent it is likely to be, but at the expense of others' freedom to respond. Take the narrated TV documentary, for instance. I speak to you in a style that has the superficial appearance of spontaneous speech. But in fact, I'm reading a text off an auto cue. A text that's been carefully written, revised and polished to combine maximum information with economy of words. And of course, to project me as a shrewd, reliable, amiable fellow. Several people have had a hand in making this film, and many others are quoted within it. But the fact that it's all framed within my discourse gives me...
Find some way of actually breaking it, of breaking your control of the material, I think.
Well, what have you got in mind?
Well, I think we should get some material that we didn't get at the conference. I mean, the fact that some of the arguments that we didn't get at the conference, think a bit more about the television programme and kind of bounce those in at various points to kind of counterpoint your voice, counterpoint the action.
But, I mean, what's it going to do to my narrative? I mean, they'll be commenting on me. Will they?
Whatever they want to do. I mean, something which kind of breaks your kind of complete control of the event.
But I don't get a chance to talk back to them?
Not unless you want to.
Well, this film could go on forever and ever. I think what I'll do, I'll tell my story, and you can insert your new material when you like, okay?
Okay.
All right.
I don't think there's any problem about doing what one can, at any rate, to introduce those other missing, more marginalized elements into the discourse, because we're in the age of electronic reproduction. We have to accept, all montage and interruption is the nature of the game we're in. And so I don't think that there's any problem about it, that we're bringing those in afterwards. I think there is a slight feeling of tokenism, yes, of speaking from the margins about something, about an agenda which you didn't have the ability to set up from the inside.
In my view, then, the second day of the conference was much more combative than the first.
These three functions...
It began with the linguist, Ruqayya Hassan. She challenged Derrida's skepticism about the communicative function of language.
It is the case that arriving in the middle of a discourse, we are soon able to say what is going on, what the relations between the speakers are, and what they are on about, what meanings are being meant. This is not pay. It is because language constructs this world for us. What such a theory
Derrida
says
himself did not seem to be present. Well, it was rather early in the morning. More surprisingly, no one rose to his defence at the end of Hassan's paper.
Now, of course, to make these probabilities meaningful...
But when a little later her husband, M.A.K. Halliday, pressed home the same point, that the most striking thing about language is how well it works, he provoked Anthony Easthope into a bold counterattack.
It's not simply directed at the paper that, very interesting paper that Professor Halliday's just given just now, but it arises from that. It arises actually from the very first move that he made, which is where he set the limits to the discourse. And the first move was, we are talking about language as communication, and we will rule out of court failures of communication. Now, it would seem to me to worry one in the first place that the failures have to be placed outside so that something can take its place inside. It would be much stronger if one could account for the failures. And what I'm going to suggest very quickly is a way of thinking about the failures of communication that is, in fact, taking to pieces the communication model.
For me, the fundamental issues in a conference of this kind would be about the whole question of that incompatibility between what linguistics is addressing, which is the structure and system of language, and what so-called literary theory has been addressing, which is much more been concerned with precisely looking at the kind of the social, conventional, ideological reasons for language being shaped in certain ways and producing certain meanings.
It's wrong to think you can pick up a piece of language and turn it over and see the stamp of ideology on it, because, as we agree, I think language is ideological in the specific ways it's used. You could take a phrase of language and use it one way for a particular kind of effect and use the same phrase for another way.
Linguists are still most convincing at the levels below the level of the semantic, whereas it seems to me literary interconnects with linguistics and with a concern with language, principally at the level of the semantic and at the levels beyond the semantic, cultural systems, discursive formations, etc. And these are always, they are bounded areas, but they're more open-ended. They're precisely what one means by discursive. They're constantly subject to renegotiation, reformulation, rearticulation, etc. And so I don't think the linguists really know very much about that.
Would not tend to notice that.
Later, Easthope shared a break in the conference proceedings with Colin McCabe and Catherine Belzy. She took the communication model apart from a feminist position.
To me from this conference, as based on the notion of language as expressive of an experience which is already there in place prior to language. Now that, one of the interesting things from my point of view has been that seems to go along with, that model of language seems to go along with a particular use of language which now seems to me quite striking and quite offensive, which is what feminists call he-man language. They're talking about man and man's communication with man and nature, or identifying the generalized reader or author as he fairly consistently. Now, what that would do would be to rule out my experience as being expressed at all. In other words, my experience has no place to be. Now, what I don't want to do is put up a struggle for a language which does express my experience, but change the model so that we don't see language as expressive of experience at all, but rather language as constitutive of experience, so that all that he-man language becomes explanatory of the kinds of problems that women in our culture seem to undergo.
There's a whole tendency within feminism to try and talk about the effect of language on the position of women, and a movement to try and change the position of women by changing language. So you try and change conventions about using he to she, and then more obscurely changing words like history to her story, with the assumption that actually that is going to substantially alter the position of women in society. And while some of that is clearly right, other parts of it are based on very dubious theoretical assumptions.
By the halfway point of the conference, a clear division was opening up between functionalists and deconstructionists. Each side, however, claimed to be the side of the angels, to be open-minded, progressive, cooperative, anti-authoritarian. For Stanley Fish, this was much too cosy a debate. He prefaced his talk by telling us about two other papers he might have given.
Both papers are part of my relentless campaign against some of the so-called virtues that have already received pious endorsement at this conference. Openness, flexibility, indeterminacy, generosity of mind, and the acknowledgement of difference. For all of these, I would substitute the notion of persuasion, which I would define as a desire for mastery and closure. And I would argue first that the situation of persuasion, of being either its object or its practitioner, is universal and cannot be escaped, that there is nothing outside of persuasion. This, not surprisingly, is also the burden of the paper I will give, withholding the missing portion, Power, Meaning, and Persuasion in Freud's The Wolfman. I have two epigraphs. The first is from James Strachey's introduction or preface to Freud's introductory lectures. Freud, Strachey says, to his translation, Freud, Strachey says, was never rhetorical and was entirely opposed to laying down his views in an authoritarian fashion. The second is a report by the Wolfman of what he thought to himself as he met Freud for the first time. And I quote, "This man is a Jewish swindler. He wants to use me from behind and shit on my head." This paper is dedicated to the proposition that the Wolfman got it right.
In other hands, Fish's analysis of the Wolfman might have seemed a devastating attack on Freud's integrity. Fish's point, however, was that rhetoric does not compromise reality, but constitutes it.
From those same anxieties. The thesis of psychoanalysis is that one cannot get to the side of the unconscious. The thesis of this paper is one cannot get to the side of rhetoric. These two theses are one and the same. Thank you.
This was a starker version of the argument put to me the previous evening by Jane Tompkins. Not surprisingly, perhaps, since she's also Mrs. Fish. Namely, that instead of aspiring or pretending to dialogism, we should admit our monologic designs on other people.
I am not in any way denying the determinate authority of facts. My question always is, where does that authority come from? My answer to that question is that authority comes from interpretive communities, rhetoric, the structures of a discipline, etc. My answer also is that knowledge in no way impugns those facts.
Are there several kinds of rationality on this view?
Sure.
This is what I would deny. I think we ought to draw this conversation to a conclusion now. I know that Raymond Williams wants to say something about that.
Okay, maybe we could make a good start at 9 o'clock for this first session of the last day. I'm tempted to call this a word from our sponsor. We have Alan Durant and Nigel Fabb, who are going to be talking about new courses in the linguistics of writing.
The way we tried to
Our two young organisers, looking a little like Pete and Dud, shared the description of the Strathclyde course in literary linguistics. Some members of the audience wondered how they could cover so much ground in a year.
And what you work towards is a kind of literacy, not a kind of a knowledge. A knowledge of what things you want to know. And when you know what things you want to know, you find out where you find them and how you find them out.
You then don't have to know them because you know where they are if you ever need to know them. I mean, for example, the way we teach the history of English literature is to do 3 texts. We do Henry V, Lyrical Ballads, and Emma. And we pick those particular texts because they are massively complex and I mean, in those texts in themselves kind of expand out to raise all sorts of interesting questions. We sort of feel like once you can do Henry V, if you've done it right, you can then do King Lear or Paradise Lost. I mean, in a sense, that would be the idea. It's a training in skills rather than a training in kind of knowledge.
As the conference rolled remorselessly on, steered by anxious, clock-watching chairmen, the main body of the audience became more restive.
In a way, what I was trying to do was to replicate the kind of activity of interpreting which I think we should seek to encourage in our students. And unless we can do that, then I think that much of what has been said or will be said at this conference is really rather pointless.
I think, unfortunately, we'll have to stop here because we're running a bit over time. I apologise to the colleague there.
And it was clear in the question time that there were people from the floor who had important points to make, but they were cut out, and it was only recognised academics, people who are structurally safe for this conference, whose positions are known, who were allowed to articulate positions. It was clear to me anyway that people who might be certified as dangerous or having something that might contradict or problematise the way that this is running were cut out. I don't know what you think.
And the conference is also continually paying lip service to referring to a wider political and social context, but continually failing to do that.
It's important to talk about the way that Margaret Thatcher is blighting the lives of millions of people. It's important to talk about the way in which her unholy alliance with Reagan might lead to a situation in which there's nothing to talk about because there's no world left. Obviously, those topics were dear to the mind of many people in the audience, and I think they were rightly looking for some more explicit connection between, if you like, language and politics.
I mean, the great academic disease, if you like, is that we're confined to expressing our ideas in a peculiarly esoteric linguistic form, and that is a rift between the ivory tower universities and making sense of what we're saying as a political practice in the culture.
There's this great move back to the classics. There's this idea that somehow we've been wrecked by feminism, by Marxism, by the third world, by deconstruction. They're always strung together as the enemy of what it means to be literate and cultural and responsible.
However successful one may be in having an influence on intellectuals and younger intellectuals and so forth, that's no substitute for political movements.
With the arrival of new Shape, something different is about to happen to the Fit family. Shape is ideal on toasted tea cakes and muffins, has half the fat of butter and margarine, yet tastes just as good. It's a roaring success. New Shape. Tastes like butter, only half the fat.
In Marseillan, we have a well-kept secret. Noailly. Here under the warm Mediterranean sun, the magic begins to happen. Slowly, the secret of Noailly is revealed. An aperitif so cool, dry, and refreshingly French. Noailly. Come share our secret.
A weekend evening, a residential street, an older car. That's how it happens. Because most car thieves are joyriders. They want a car. It can cost you more than an irons.
Towing fees, repairs to bodywork, loss of no claims bonus.
So if your car's a few years old and you want to keep it locked and fit an anti-theft device.
The highlight of Sunday morning was Jacques Derrida's session. Derrida had elected to answer questions rather than to give a formal paper. The questions had been submitted in advance.
Your work is sometimes attacked by those who speak in the name of reason, yet their attacks are often framed in terms of pragmatic rather than rational arguments. That is, they complain of the dangerous effects of your arguments rather than of any contradiction of the laws of reason. Do you have an explanation for this inconsistency in your critics, and do you make judgments of either kind upon your own work?
those people who make such a could I speak French? Who charge deconstructionism with being irrationalist. Think that each time you ask a question about reason, when you ask a question about the history of reason, where does reason come from, what is the principle of reason as distinguished from reason itself, because the principle of reason is something very specific in the history of reason. Each time you ask such a question about the effects of rationalism, not of reason, but of some sort of rationalism, etc., you are speaking against reason. So you are charged with being irrationalist and with shaking, with undermining the rationality, the science, objectivity, and so on.
In person, Derrida certainly belied his reputation as a kind of intellectual terrorist bent on destroying the foundations of Western metaphysics. He was gentle, modest, and charming. When the lady from Australia teased him with a deliberately tortuous allusion to his remarks on negative theology the previous evening, he was puzzled but good-humoured.
I merely see in the relationship between what you were saying last night and our presence here today a delicious irony. I thought that the recognition of that irony might appeal to you.
The only analogy I would find between the Christian negative theology scene I was describing last night and this one is my suffering here.
Before Colin McCabe gave his closing opening statement, 30 minutes had been set aside for general comments from the floor of the conference. It was not long enough.
So I just want to say really that I feel I've been lured here under false pretenses and I'd like my money back if possible.
I was a little bit surprised and a bit upset that throughout this conference, with a couple of notable exceptions, we've been couched in a peculiarly Eurocentric position. And I'd have thought that that would have developed from the work from 1958. And I didn't expect to see that here. And I'm just thinking if the agenda for the next 30 years has been set here, then I might as well go to sleep.
It was just enormously centered. It was still centered. It was still in place somehow. It was still sitting in the Western world, still sure of its ground, although it was problematizing it all the time. This is a curious paradox. It was a conference about problematization, but it didn't problematize its own discourse in that deeply kind of profound way. And so I think it found it extremely difficult to admit and acknowledge those questions from the margin.
Obviously, there could have been discussion of the ways in which English is developing as a world language. That takes us immediately to third world states and the post-colonial era, what's happening to the English language in those contexts. And then, a second point is what's happening to English in Britain and in the already English-speaking nations. I mean, I'd want to say straight away that Britain, of course, is a multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society, and those points of contact are manifestly there.
It seems to me that one does not achieve difference in literary studies simply by saying we're tired of Joyce and Proust, now let's read third world literature. One rather achieves this by showing how each type of socioeconomic situation in this global pattern gives a different function to culture, generates different kinds of text, different roles for intellectuals, and so on.
For me, it doesn't work by saying if you just gather all these different type of influences together, if we can just hold hands for these 3 days, then somehow we'll arrive at a greater statement. I think that the conditions of contact between those cultures, how they're negotiated between the different disciplines too, that's essential to talk about those power relations.
A great deal has been done. I have a comment and a question about context. The question is, can I have the TV cameras switched off while I make my comment?
Yeah, turn off the TV camera, please.
I think that there was a collusion between the camera and between the organisers of the conference, because I think, for example, the way in which Jacques Derrida was presented he was presented as some sort of an intellectual Blake Carrington, and I think there's a sense in which there was a sort of a Dallas scenario anyway, and that we were working, it was South Fork Ranch on stage, you know, and we felt like the cattle, we in the audience, and the inflation of Jacques Derrida.
That was sort of the David Lodge syndrome that he was saying in his triumphant moment in that evening. Here's the book, and we're making the film, and you can be a part in it if you want as well.
My first thought was this is an Open University program.
Do we think of this television film as an extension of the conference, as a sort of continuation of the conference in somebody's living room? I doubt it. I mean, I think it has more sort of anecdotal and entertainment value, perhaps, or just satisfying people's curiosity, seeing what academics do when they're at conferences.
Television does not have a good track record in the representation of this kind of event. I mean, it is very easy to pour scorn on this kind of endeavour, and therefore one can't help but sympathise with the kind of sense of distrust about it.
I think they should have been told that that it was going to be televised, and then people at least get a choice of wanting to dress for the cameras, or having things they want to talk about for the cameras. Can actually perform for the cameras. And in a way, I mean, the idea of documentary, they can go in there and film the event and somehow it'll work, was a bit naive on the part of the people who went in there to make the programme.
Probably they felt one way or another, someone or some other one was taking advantage. They were not, simply maybe because they were not paid.
It would be awful if television was, committed only to the trivial, the surface flow across, if it could never be a medium which explored the serious problems and ideas of a culture in an intellectual sense. It would be ruinous if that were so. And what that would do is simply to reproduce the unequal distribution of knowledge of which, which that conference, in a sense, was a product.
Now, this conference has seen a professional class who have the strength of capital behind them speak quite loudly for capital and for that class.
There's a young Scottish guy who got up and started speaking. I think he tried to get a lot in because he probably thought he didn't have much time. So I kind of ended up really listening hard to try and understand it.
I would like to have seen a conference which reflected to some degree Glasgow's culture, reflected to some degree the context of the conference, the fact that the conference was being held in Glasgow. And I think to some degree conferences are inevitably international, that you do have this international community of academics who descend on one particular location, but the location is sort of a flattened out and you lost all sense of perspective within the conference hall itself.
But he was the only Glaswegian I really heard there, so it's a bit like the Edinburgh Festival in a way. Everybody descends on the city for a couple of years and then they all go away.
To construct such a montage...
Colin McCabe commenced his winding-up speech to this mutinous audience by admitting that the structure of the conference had been, if not capitalist, certainly elitist, privileging the position of the main speakers.
This was simply a risk that we took, and a risk which, on the whole, I myself feel was quite justified. Though one of the points of a discursive event like this is that it has many ramifications. The ramifications immediately within the conference hall, but perhaps much more importantly, the ramifications in terms of the extent to which people feel they can use work or ideas here in relation to their own practice. And my talk, and I'm still really hesitating about whether to plunge into my talk or not, my talk...
In fact, he did plunge, but waded through his text, increasingly conscious of the dissent still bubbling on the conference floor.
Only someone insensitive to the imbrication of power and language could confuse as equivalent sentences written in popular text.
Jane Tompkins passed a note up to the chair suggesting that the open discussion should be continued.
Concerned with All right, so I'm getting a message. All right, okay. Leave us 10 minutes for my talk. Okay. I think it's felt to give me that with all this stuff about power and authority, to give this the authority of the last word is to compound the problems already pointed out. I think that the easy answer to that is to do what we wanted to avoid doing, but which, bowing to what is obviously a general wish, which was simply to let the conference kind of deflate slowly as people go off to get there.
Why don't we take a vote?
You want to continue the discussion now?
Why don't we take a vote?
Yes. Yes, sure.
People who would like to hear the continuation of the talk, please put your hands up now. And for the alternative, which is for Colin to finish his talk now and relinquish the podium. Okay, I'm afraid the second group lose. Colin finishes his talk.
In the wonderful situation that I'm now aware of, there seem to be at least 30 to 40 people.
When Colin McCabe had finished, a diminishing rump continued the inquest.
Of the kind of educational questions that are posed by these considerations. Thank you.
It seems to me important to note is how difficult it is for the best intentioned people who are indeed you to break out of the inherited forms which are not empty forms but which have content in them, which have political content in them. I also think that the audience bears some responsibility for not having at an earlier point made its wishes known, made its views heard. I mean, the audience conspires and collaborates in these structures.
Okay.
Every conference has a plot, and every good plot has a reversal, a surprise twist in its tale. The plot of this conference, the one designed by the organisers, was a confrontation of two broadly opposed approaches to the linguistics of writing. On the one hand, functionalist linguistics and formalist stylistics of a fairly familiar kind, and on the other hand, new approaches influenced by recent critical theory, deconstructionist, pragmatic, ideological, rhetorical. If there was a winner of this contest, it was probably the more orthodox group, maybe because it was more united, maybe because some of the opposition's biggest guns didn't show up. The reversal came in the last session when the main body of conferees rose up and complained that they had been repressed by the structure of the conference, patronized by the principal speakers, and intimidated by the presence of the TV cameras. Suddenly, the conference itself became the subject of the conference, and all the issues which we'd been discussing rather airily and abstractly for the past 3 days, about language and power and authority and dialogue, became very concrete and very personally felt, not least by the makers of this film. Did we distort the event by recording it? Let Jacques Derrida have the last word. Not that he would admit such a thing could exist.
We had to reflect on the fact that today an international conference had to be recorded. The voices have to be recorded, and the spectacle has to be recorded. Not only for further use or reproduction, but to become conscious of these technological necessity. We are speaking of writing, and I think that film is a kind of writing. The linguistics of writing have to integrate the linguistics of filming, all sorts of recording. So I think it's not an obstacle, not only not an obstacle, but a necessity today to have conference.
All conferences I've ever attended always have a session where everybody gets really fed up with the way it's been structured. It's just ritualistic. It's always there. I mean, people go seduced by the speakers and stuff, right? And then the speakers are there and they perform, everybody listens, and then somehow people get really oppressed and they want to speak and they want more discussion, and then it turns back on the conference itself and people begin to attack and stuff.
Most conferences end in exactly the revolt and explosion that you were the recipient of, and that's really a very fundamental archetype of this kind of narrative.
Here we actually had people, quite frankly, talking in jargon. Now, jargon, as I define it, is the sort of language, not particularly obfuscation, although obfuscation is there, but it is language used by a small in-group. They all understand it, and quite honestly, does it matter whether anybody else does? And here we were looking at a program which, quite understandably, those who were involved in it were using these words. I mean, discourse is not usually used in that way. Deconstruction, I think a lot of people find very hard to work out. And there was the most blissful phrase, which I really enjoyed, which was spoken without the vestige of a blush by, I think, Jane Tompkins, which was, we must develop an openness about our closure.
I really laughed my head off almost at the end of the film when somebody said the main issue in the conference, towards the end of the conference, was the conference. You know, I think that said it all, really.
I mean, it's people talking and talking fast, not listening to the other one because the other one doesn't talk, and not listening to themselves. So, I mean, goblins, as I call them, nice goblins.
Don't you think the interruptions really did make a kind of dialogic text to the programme?
Well, originally I didn't like the idea, and I still don't like the idea.